The interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project for the Library of Congress. The veteran's name is Frank Cox. They were born on December 1st, 1944. He served in Vietnam. He achieved the rank of colonel, and we are recording this on October 8th, 2013. I am William Richter, and I'm conducting the interview. No relation. Thank you, Frank, for sitting down and talking with us today.
Glad to, Will, and thank you for the initiative.
Yes, sir. We're looking forward to your stories. So if you want to start off, tell us about your family when you were younger, if you had any siblings, what life was like growing up.
Well, I grew up here in Clemson, South Carolina, and Clemson, when I grew up, was a very, very small town, and Clemson was an all-male, all-military school, so it's a very unique little town. I have an older brother. Well, my dad, here's the story. My father came here in 1935 as a 16-year-old and on a football scholarship. Played football here at Clemson and the first team to go to a bowl game on the Cotton Bowl team in 1939. And he married my mom and served in World War II. And I was born and grew up here. I had an older brother, 2 years older than me. And then 8 years later, we had a little sister, a little red-headed sister named Grace. And then we had a little brother who was born about 8 years later after that, named Bill. So there are 3 boys and a girl in my family. I lost my mother in 1985 to a brain tumor, and my father remarried. But my dad started working here at Clemson in 1939 after he graduated as a football coach. And in 1985, I think, he became president of the university. So my dad was dean of students, and he was vice president for student. He was a president. He was the vice president for development. He had all kind of jobs. So I grew up in the shadow of Clemson and in the shadow of my family here. And I went to Daniel High School and got a football scholarship to Clemson. And I studied chemical engineering here. Went through Army ROTC and graduated and went on active duty.
Okay.
And that's kind of my childhood here. But for those that have never been to Clemson, it's still a fairly small town centered around a wonderful university, and it was when I grew up.
Okay. Could you tell us about your time at Clemson specifically? Talk about football, your time with ROTC, and what that was like.
I had a great. I have one regret in life. You shouldn't have any regrets, but I have one regret. I was a lousy student. I majored in chemical engineering, and I have a lot of good friends, and they tease me about this. Clemson when I started in 1963, and we went on orientation in August. We went into Tillman Hall, into the auditorium in Tillman Hall, and there was no air conditioning, and it was hot and miserable. And about halfway through the introductions and all the things they did, they said, everybody that wants to major in chemical engineering, line up over here. Off I went to sign up for chemical engineering. No rhyme, no reason. Most of these kids that come to school, they have a pretty good idea what they want to major in, but I didn't. So I trudge off and I get involved in one of the hardest curriculums at Clemson. It was intense. So my experience at Clemson academically was a big challenge in chemical engineering. I have a couple of stories about it. But I signed up for in 63, all the students, it was compulsory to be in ROTC. We had about 2,300 people that drilled every Thursday. There's a sea of military on Bowman Field, the parade field out there. We line up in where the Harcum is. Mm-hmm. They've converted it into a student union there, but it used to just be a big old concrete parking lot. And you'd form in the parking lot there, and they'd march out, and we'd march out to the parade field. And we'd go to the ROTC draw rifles. We'd march with M1 rifles. It was a lot of fun. So for 2 years I had ROTC, and then my junior year I opted for advanced ROTC, and I ended up getting a commission through the ROTC program. I went out for football. I was recruited to come here to play football. Clemson had a real character as head coach, and his name's Frank Howard. There are a lot of stories about Frank Howard, the old coach here, Coach Howard. Well, Coach Howard offered me a scholarship. My brother was here on a football scholarship. My brother was a very competent, highly qualified athlete. He was a state champion in track. He played on basketball. He was an All-American football player. So he was a starter at Clemson, and I was kind of a scrub, if you would. I was on the team. Coach Howard used to have this expression, and he'd say, I went to first team over here and the second team over there, and all you others, you go over there. Well, I was part of the others for my career at Clemson. But I played football for 4 years. I played guard, and I'm a little guy. I'm 5'6", and so today I couldn't possibly play football today. They're all big and fast and strong. So I have two football stories. First of all, in Clemson's history, my dad came here, as I mentioned, in 1935. Well, at the same time, there was an African-American named Herman McGee who came. Herman was 15 years old. He walked on the campus, and he worked in the athletic department. And basically, he was a trainer. In those days, he hadn't gone through the physical therapy and all the programs they did, but he taped ankles and put you in the whirlpool and did all that, and he cleaned up the equipment and took care of all the equipment in the training room and so forth. Well, Herman, Clemson in 1966, we were going to play Wake Forest at Wake Forest, and that was the first African American that Clemson was going to play against. And he was a lineman who played guard for Wake Forest. So Herman came up to me right before practice and said, don't go out for practice, I want you to stay in. So we all got dressed, everybody went out for practice. Well, in those days we had a plywood box where we would go in, and we wore high top shoes, not Nikes or all that. We had these big old Clyde shoes that we wore in practice. So we had literally like shoe paint in the box. So we'd paint, you'd put black on your shoes to keep your shoes pliable and so forth. Well, we painted the number of the Wake Forest player on my jersey, and then blacked my skin. Put black all over my face, and black my arms, black my legs. And so, there I was in black with this guy's number out. Out I come running out to practice. Of course, team went nuts. The team went nuts. And so that was that's in several of the Clemson history of Clemson football books. When Herman McGee and Frank Cox teamed up to introduce Clemson to the black football players, and so that's not a novelty today. As a matter of fact, it'd be an insult today, politically incorrect, but we did it. And Coach Howard was very politically incorrect. And I think the second thing that was interesting while I played is that we won the ACC championship 3 years in a row, back to back to back. So we were the champs 3 years in a row. And Clemson hadn't done that since, and nobody in the conference has won it 3 years in a row except us. So that's pretty neat. Now I go back to Herman McGee. When I was little, my dad coached baseball a couple of years, and I'd go over there and shag balls and just hang around the baseball field. And do you know where the baseball field was? It's where the tennis courts are now. Baseball field used to be there. And the baseball field, we had a beautiful new baseball field, but at one time it was right there, so it was close to home. And I could ride my bike over there and so forth. But I was the bat boy for the team, and I would travel with the team, and when we go to the different places, they'd all bunk up, and I would always bunk with Herman McGee. So I grew up, Herman was like a older brother or a second dad for me when I grew up. But I have a lot of fond memories of Clemson in that. And another story, and my buddies give me a hard time about this today, but if you come up behind where the tennis courts is and you walk all the way down there behind the soccer, Clemson used to have a 220-yard straightaway. So when they ran the 220-yard dash or the 200-meter dash, it was straight. Now they run it on a track, a curve. But it used to be a straight, and that was a race. Well, they'd set up hurdles out there. And one of the last events they'd run doing it would be a 220-meter hurdle. Wow. So I came home when I was about 6 years old and told my mama, I want to be a hurdler. And she looked at me and she said, son, I think you better get another event. I had little short legs. I still do, very short legs. those are some memories, some fond memories of Clemson. And but I think one of the neat things that the students don't see today that was really, there used to be several pageants a year with the military, and the town would fill up with parents and girlfriends and all this, and they'd have these gigantic parades and military ceremonies out on the Bowman Field, and they were big deals in those days. Football, and when I was growing up, football is nothing like it is today. The stadium was small, and it seated about 18 or 20,000, so, and it was never hardly full. And later on, it grew, and now it's spectacular. So, but I can remember the hill is Clemson's kind of famous for the hill. Well, when I was growing up, that was a playground for kids. Nobody sat there. The kids would get out there and roll down the hill, or run down, and so it's interesting to go to the games now and see the change. But when I grew up, most kids didn't go to watch football games. They went there to play. We had a lot of fun. We'd play ball in, but where the West Zone was a huge, big area. And we'd go down there and be playing touch football. We'd have our own little game going on while the regular game was going out there.
So
it's interesting.
Yeah. So this is about the same time that Harvey Gantt.
Harvey Gantt came, and Harvey Gantt came when I was a freshman.
Okay.
And my recollection of the integration of Clemson was that it was virtually seamless. That there was literally no student angst and no demonstrations and no. I'm sure there was prejudice and there was some incidents that occurred. He was an architecture student, and you're probably familiar with what architect students are. They are
in the studio.
They're down there. They might as well be in a cage. They're down there all the time.
Yeah.
So he was not in the. He just didn't put himself in the spotlight and everything. He's very studious and everything. So, and the group that I was mostly involved with, the ROTC and so forth, we were just too busy to. We didn't have time to worry about any of that stuff. And I think that Dr. Edwards, who was the president, and my dad, who was the dean of students at the time, were so positive and progress for Clemson and it's the right thing to do that it kind of wasn't a big deal. I think the hardest thing for Clemson was to go from all military to a co-educational school in the 50s. And I think that transition and I guess in your lifetime, were you aware of when VMI went co-ed? Did you follow any of that? I guess you didn't. Or when Citadel went co-ed? I mean, it was the old guys were bitter. Women don't belong here. And so I think the administration had gone through that, so they knew what to expect in terms of student behavior and old guard behavior. Old guys, old grad behavior. So it was a pretty smooth thing. Now you may talk to other people that saw different experiences, but it was almost, from my standpoint, a non-event when Harvey Gantt came.
Okay.
But I do have there's a Frank Howard story. Frank Howard used to talk bad about he didn't have the same genteelness about him that the other people did. So there were a lot of stories. Coach Howard, he went to a All-Star game, the East-West All-Star game out in California, and there's a huge, big black tackle out there. And he said, "Boy, I wish I could whitewash you and take you back to Clemson."
Oh wow!
That kind of. So for those that knew Coach Howard, he was a little more prejudiced because of his upbringing and everything.
Sure.
But I think the administration in general were very tolerant and very, very forward thinking when Clemson integrated and moved forward.
Yeah.
And I went through and I tell you what, when I joined the Army, I went in the Army in 1968. Well, in 1968, the women were segregated in the Army. The women were in their own branch called the Women's Army Corps. They had their own school and so forth. They were not integrated in the regular Army. And so they had the very stereotypical women's job, in those days, clerical and so forth. And in 1972, when I was a student, in one of my courses that I went through, the Army announced that they were going to integrate women into the military. And I went through a whole lot of this. What the hell are they doing? Why we have women in the Army? And the Women's Army Corps, their school and headquarters was at Fort McClellan, Alabama. And the chemical school, the chemical corps was in Fort McClellan, Alabama. And when I went down there, they had a study group. And our class, when I was going through that, we went over and met with the study group, and they gave their presentation of how they were going to move forward and integrate into the Army. And I thought it was pretty remarkable that, and I watched that evolution over the years. And by the time I was commander, probably some of my superstars were women in the military. So I was blessed by that diversity initiative that the Army's gone through. So that's another story.
Okay.
Another story
Yeah.
about my Army days.
So talk about your training and how you got into the Clemson Corps. What was that like? How is it different from the normal Army experience, if you will?
Well, let me talk to you about I'll give you my whole training history of what all I achieved in my career. I went to Fort McClellan, Alabama in 1968, July of 1968, and it was hotter than Hades down there, and the Army takes an officer after in ROTC you go to summer camp. Are you familiar with that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so our summer camp was 6 weeks long. It was at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And I had a great experience up there. The chairman of the Board of Trustees, David Wilkins, and I were in the same outfit up there. We had a good time up there. And so when I went to Fort McClellan for my introduction into the Army, my induction, if you would, in the Army, there were about 60 lieutenants, and we all went through this very, very rigorous training program. And in those days, the chemical equipment was relatively primitive. They didn't have some of the sophisticated fabrics and textiles and things they have now. And you can imagine it's about 100 degrees, about 90% humidity, and we got into these very thick, heavy woolen underwear, completely impregnated with paraffin, chlorinated paraffin. And then once you got in that, then you climbed into what they call a butyl rubber suit. It was horrific, and we had, out of 60 people, maybe 8 or 10, they're so hot they just went down with heat exhaustion.
It's like wearing a car tire.
It's literally like wearing being a saran wrap, I guess now would be the equivalent. So that was a very meaningful experience going through the training at Fort McClellan. Mm-hmm. And then while I was down there going through this training, I went over to, I was right in the height of Vietnam, and I went over to, my assignment was to stay at Fort McClellan, and I was going to a training unit that was located there. It's called Tigerland. Clemson Tigers at Tigerland. So I went over and met with the officer that was in charge of the receiving you, called the adjutant. I went over and met with the adjutant of this unit, and he said, "You'll probably be here 3 months to go to Vietnam." And at that time I was not ready to go to Vietnam, and so I came back over, and I was having a cup of coffee in the snack bar at the school, and one of my buddies walked up to me and asked me what I was doing and where I was going. He said, "Why don't you come and go where I'm going? I'm going up to Maryland to Aberdeen Proving Ground and be in this unit called Tech Escort." And I said, "What do you have to do?" He said, "I don't know." So I called up to the assignment people, the human resources people, if you would, for the Army. They call them MILPO. They're the military personnel people. And they said, if you want to go up there, you have to extend a year in the Army. I had a 2-year commitment at the time. So I said, fine, I'll do that. So I went to Aberdeen Proving Ground, and I was in a unit called Tech Escort. In order to be in that unit, you had to go through 3 months of some very specialized training, because their job was to transport and render safe chemical and biological weapons. So I went through that training program, and that was pretty intense. And went off to this unit and spent 2 years in the unit and got orders to go to Vietnam. And so I went to Vietnam, and I served in an infantry unit in Vietnam for a year. Had a good experience over there. And my last month, we were in the process of closing down, that's something I want to show you. My job, there was no chemical warfare going on in Vietnam. We used, one of the jobs that the Chemical Corps had was, believe it or not, was the use of flame. We had flamethrowers, and they used flamethrowers in World War II. I don't know if you've seen movies of flamethrowers for caves and all that. So we had weapons were flame, and we also used a tear gas when the Vietnamese, you had a lot of bunkers and tunnels down there, and so we would put tear gas in there to flush them out and so forth. Well, I was responsible for the safety of the base from the standpoint that all the devices and everything that were for safety of the defensive network, I was out there for our fire base. So we had concertina wire and we had some weapons embedded out there and so forth. Well, I was responsible for that. There was a colonel that was over me. And with about a month ago, we had a hurricane came through, a typhoon. It literally destroyed the place. I mean, destroyed it. There wasn't a building left standing. And so he came up to me, he said, Frank, you got to get us a place to sleep and a place we can eat. So he gave me three. He said, go get a couple of 3 soldiers and y'all figure out what to do. So we got a couple of trucks and we went and found, we got 20 tents. A couple of great big tents, GP large they call them, general purpose tents, big large tents. Scrounged up some tables and chairs and some cots and some things and got them all put up. And he was impressed. He didn't think we could get anything. We thought we were just going to sleep on the ground for we had about a month left in the country. And so he called me in and he said, you got the right stuff, you ought to stay in the Army. He said, if you don't extend in this as a regular Army officer, they're getting ready to downsize after Vietnam. You'll get put out. So I signed up for regular Army.
Okay.
So
And let's cycle back. Where in Vietnam were you stationed?
Vietnam had basically 4 combat zones. The combat zone that was closest to North Vietnam was called I Corps.
Okay.
And I was in a fire base that was about 60 miles south of Da Nang, which is a big, huge, beautiful port city, and a big build-up with beautiful beaches, and Navy ships could get in and out of there, and big air base there. I was on a fire base called Duc Pho, and when I was in the infantry for a while, we were on a fire base called Hill 411. That was just a geographical name for it. So there's a major road that runs all the way from Hanoi down to Saigon called QL1, like US 1, Highway 1, and Duc Pho was about 60 miles south of Da Nang. It was right on QL1, and 411 was about 20 miles north of there and about 10 miles out into the mountains, and it was about 20 miles off the highway. So I spent my time basically there. And I was during the day, each day we had a piece of equipment called an airborne personnel detector, and we'd put it on a helicopter and fly around out in the middle of nowhere, out in bad guy country, if you would, out in the west where the NVA were building up. And we would fly out there and locate where the people were, and we would map out where the people were. And I did that every morning about 6 o'clock. We'd go out and fly for 2 hours. So I flew every day almost for a year, and got to meet a lot of the pilots. And the pilots in Vietnam were really the heroes of that war. They're unsung heroes. But a lot of Clemson people served throughout that whole era, and I ran into Clemson people up and down the whole corridor. I landed in Saigon and then took a plane up to Da Nang area and ran into a couple of Clemson people at the training center there. And then we had one Clemson man that was in our brigade. And I never did run into anybody that I knew from Clemson over there. And let me tell you a story about my dad and his combat experience. And
give us a little history about your dad.
Dad, when Dad went through Clemson as military school, and almost all of his class ended up serving in World War II. He had quite a few killed, as you know. But he trained up. He was an infantry officer, and he trained up and when he got called, he went to Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, and joined the Ohio division from Ohio. And they got on a train, went to San Francisco, and got on a troop ship and went to New Zealand. And they trained down there, and then they did what they call island hop behind the Marines. So the Marines would land, secure the island, then the Army would come in and clean it all up. So they island hopped up, and when he got to the Fijis, he got hurt. And he was being evac'd. He was on a Jeep, and they had 2 stretchers on the back of the Jeep. He was laying on one of these stretchers, and he said, I felt like the Dickens. He had something, I'm sure exactly what it was, something, a gut wound or something. And he said, I was feeling pretty bad. And it was raining, and I was just feeling sorry for myself. And we pulled up to an intersection, and there was an MP there controlling traffic. And a Jeep pulled up, stopped right across from where we were. I looked over there, there's a guy wearing a Clemson ring. And I looked over there and I said, I'm Cox of 39, and the guy responded back and he said, I'm so-and-so of 41. And Dad said, right then I knew I wanted to go home. So he said, I quit feeling sorry for myself and thought about going home. And so I never had an experience in Vietnam. I got shot at a few times, but I never had an experience, a near-death experience or got hurt to the point where, I felt sorry for myself, but I saw a lot of people that were hurt. So I had a fairly innocent combat experience in terms of my own personal safety. Although we flew every day out and got shot at and all this other stuff.
So what was your experience? We'll start with the Viet Cong and talk about the Vietnamese, your experience interacting with them.
Well, we had in our one of the most interesting things about the Vietnam is that when I was in the battalion, one of the things that we did, we had a regional, they call them regional forces. They're Vietnamese. They're kind of like National Guard guys.
Okay.
They weren't in the Vietnamese army. They were kind of local. They were there to guard their villages and guard the roads and the bridges and so forth. So we helped train them and so forth. And they weren't they weren't the most disciplined of soldiers. So but what we did once a month, we'd go to a village, and for about 2 days we would give shots and perform medical from the military guys there, the RFs, we call them rough puffs, all the way down to the children. And that was a very interesting experience. But when I was there, Will, the primary enemy that we faced was the Viet Cong in the area that I was in. And we were along 2 rivers, and the Viet Cong would use the rivers for their resupply. So they used sampans and little boats and everything. And so we'd put a lot of forces and watch the rivers quite a bit. And they had infiltration routes that came out of Cambodia and North Vietnam that came down into our responsibility, our area of responsibility. And we kept troops out there and soldiers out there to guard and protect those, to keep them. And most of the skirmishes and the contact and the fights that my units were involved in were small, 20 people or less. They'd last maybe 4 to 6, 8 hours, and then they'd disappear. And so the real heavy fighting had occurred. See, I got over there in 70, and the real heavy fighting had occurred between 67 and 70. And by 70, I guess from a strategic standpoint, the NVA was just waiting us out. They knew we were going to go home. Well, late in our tour over there, we were given word to go up and backfill the South Vietnamese Army had taken positions along the border where the Marines had been. The Marines had occupied the North and South Vietnamese border. The Marines had a couple of divisions up there. Well, they had put the ARVN in there, the Army of Vietnam, to do that. Well, they were going to go into Laos and Cambodia and have a major offensive called Lam Son 719. And they sent our brigade up to fill in behind them and guard the border. And that was the most serious combat that I was involved in. We had some pretty big skirmishes up there. We had about 6 people captured, POWs, from that. And we had a whole bunch of helicopters shot up, shot down while I was up there. And that was a pretty unique experience. But for the most part, they didn't bombard us. My base, where I was, the bases, we weren't shelled or bombarded, and we weren't attacked by small units. So, but it was an interesting, my combat experience was, I was over there for about 2 weeks, short of a year, and came home. And when I got home, I had an interesting experience, Will. My best friend, who I grew up with here at Clemson, he invited me and a whole bunch of my friends, classmates, and fraternity brothers that lived in Atlanta, and we went to their house to have a dinner. Welcome home dinner. And 2 of the women just jumped all over me. Baby killer, all this kind of stuff. And my wife got so upset that we just left. And she never got over that. She, to this day, she doesn't have any respect for those 2 women that, It's my husband, he just came home from the war, what are you doing?
Yeah.
So
Did
there
you
was a
encounter
real,
lot of that? Encounter a lot
there's
of
a
that?
real serious time in I personally didn't encounter too much of that, but in the country it was bad. I mean, really bad. And I have a lot of friends who were assaulted, things thrown on them, eggs thrown on them. I wouldn't, I'm not an image. I don't look like a soldier. I don't look like a Sergeant Rock, if you would. So, and we were discouraged for a while of traveling in our uniforms. Now they travel in uniform. They're adored. Soldiers are loved now. But so we didn't run around in our uniforms and so forth. But it was a tough time in this country, and even here in Clemson, I wasn't here fortunately. So when I came back from Vietnam, I went to school for 9 months in Alabama. Then I went to Fort Bragg, to the 82nd Airborne, and that was the single most pivotal part of my career. When I went to the 82nd at that time, the Army was rebuilding after Vietnam, and the 82nd was the elite. It was the special forces of today. I mean, that was really the elite then. And so I was nurtured there by some great people, and it just kind of propelled me the rest of my career. So it was by God's lucky hand with fate, by God's luck, I just ended up in Fort Bragg and in the 82nd Airborne. Now that's a hoot, jumping out of an airplane, let me tell you.
Tell us about some of the training and
I
what
went that's a great story. After I played football at Clemson, I was in really good physical condition. Well, by the time I got back from Vietnam, I was not in very good shape. I didn't work out over there. Now they work out and they have weights and all. I mean, they stay in good shape, but I was out of shape. So when I found out I was selected to go to 82nd, I had to go through jump school, airborne school at Fort Benning. So I put a set of chin-up bars behind my house. I bought me a set of weights, and I had a little running course I'd run, and I got myself in shape. You have to be able to do 6 chin-ups. You have to be able to run a mile in 7 minutes, and you have to, I forget, we had to do either 75 sit-ups and 50 push-ups. Anyway, some physical fitness you had to do, so I had to get myself in pretty good shape. Well, I went to Fort Benning. My wife was a few months pregnant when we got down there. And we lived in my wife grew up at Fort Benning, so anytime we went to Fort Benning, it's like going home for her. And so we went down there. The first week is called Ground Week. It was October, and it was cold. It was early fall. It's cold at Fort Benning. And the Army, in its wisdom in those days, they had a protocol. So you take off your shirts, and you'd run they didn't have gym clothes. They had boots, Army pants, and Army shirt, of course. Well, you took off your shirt, took off your T-shirt. And so we were running, and this sergeant, kind of a hairy chest, this sergeant ran up, and he said, "Hey, we told you to take your shirt off." And I started laughing while we were running. He said, "You're laughing at my formation, drop." So I got out doing push-ups, and the TAC who was in the back said, "What are you doing out of formation? Get in the truck." So I go back there, and they said, "Do you want to quit?" I said, "No." He said, "What'd you do?" And then so I said, the TAC told me to follow, the TAC instructor told me to get out of formation and do push-ups. Said, you never get out of a formation, don't you understand that? Yes, sir. So I had to recycle that first week again. Jump school normally lasts 3 weeks. I did it in 4 weeks. And I'll never forget that guy who, that's a story, you know.
Yeah.
What are you doing when, told you to take your shirt off, so. That was one of life's moments, you know. It could have changed my whole career. You know, if I'd have not made jump school, I wouldn't have gone to 82nd and so forth. So that was quite an interesting reflection on back. But the requirements of jump school, you jump 5 times out of an airplane, then you go to your Fort Bragg, and I joined a unit up there, and I ended up with about 60 jumps, and I was there for a little over 4 years. And about halfway through my career there, my assignment there, the Army was considering eliminating the chemical corps after Vietnam, because there really wasn't any chemical warfare. We had signed these treaties and all these other things. So one morning I got told to go over to the post headquarters to a conference room. We went over there, there's about 10 of us in there, and the guy said, you need to find another job. We're going to eliminate the chemical corps. So I came back, told the guy I worked for, and he said, he sent me down to a unit. And so at that time I went down to the support unit, maintenance unit. I went from an infantry unit to a maintenance unit, and I ended up commanding a company there. And for 15 years I'd served a tour as a chemical corps officer for a couple of years. Then I'd serve as a maintenance officer for a couple of years. Then I'd serve as a chemical officer for a couple of years, and as a maintenance officer. So I had a very interesting career in terms of that. I never went to any formal training for maintenance.
Really?
None. But I did for chemical. I went through every school and all that. So as a maintenance officer, I was blessed because I had these wonderful technicians and people that were trained and knew what to do. So I had a good experience, and that was so if you want to know about repairing a tank turret, come see me. That doesn't apply too much to civilian work, but we had tanks and artillery and all those things up there at Fort Bragg. So that was an interesting time in my life. And I did the same thing in Germany. I went to Germany as a chemical officer in 1976, and the threat then was real. The Russians were across into East Germany and along the border. They had massive chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, biological weapons. I mean, so we did an enormous amount of training and so forth, but our equipment still wasn't that good. So one of our real problems or real issues was getting troops into equipment, getting them up to speed. But halfway through my assignment in Germany, the guy who initially sent me down to that sport unit showed up in our unit. He was a general by then, and he said, you're going down to this maintenance outfit. So I went down to a maintenance outfit. And my wife can recall to this day, we lived about half a mile from a big, huge motor pool. And one of the capabilities we had in this maintenance unit was we had these gigantic trucks that you could put a tank up on, call them HETs, heavy equipment transport, great big, semi-trailer, and these long, huge, heavy-duty trailers behind them, semis with it, and you could hear them crank up in the morning. So about 3 o'clock in the morning, they'd be going off to go do something. She'd wake me up and say, you hear them? You hear the heads? So I was responsible for the heads. Had a sergeant, had an E6, staff sergeant who was responsible for it, had 6 of them, and he was a great guy. And he kept me out of trouble with the heads. And when I came back from Germany, I came back from Germany in '79, and that was from 1968 when I came into 1979. I had never thought about getting out, staying in. What am I going to do? And the day before I left Germany, I got a call from my brother's best friend, who was a stockbroker at Hilton Head. He's with Wells Fargo now, but at the time I forget who he was with, maybe Prudential. But he called me and he said, Frank, when you get back to the States, I want to talk to you. So my wife and I, we flew into Charleston, we came to Clemson, spent a few days, and we went down to Hilton Head. He wanted me to come to work for him. And he said that I was making at the time, you don't make much, back then I didn't make much money, but he said, well, your first year, I'll pay you $1,000. And after that, you'll be on your own for commission. And I said, I'm not going to get out of the Army for $1,000? I don't think so. I didn't have any clients, and I hadn't been through the training or anything. I said, we'll starve in a year. So I decided to stay in. That's the first time I made a decision to stay in the Army. And or just kind of the second time, I guess. So that was an interesting moment. Then I went off, and after that I had some great experiences. I went from there, I went to the school. I wrote doctrine for like 2 years in the school. Went to a staff college, a intermediate school when you're about 11 or 12 years in the military, called Command and General Staff College. I went through that training.
Talk about that. What is that like? What do they teach you?
Well, the Army has got a wonderful training program. So when you're second lieutenant, they have a little orientation program. When you're captain, they have a little orientation program. Mostly to make you proficient at your technical skills. And then when you become a major, in your middle of your career, they send you to Command and General, and that broadens you to be more of a staff officer.
Okay.
To be able to fill in and do work, various types of jobs here and there. And also where I went was a joint school, and so we had Air Force, Navy, Marines, and some civilians there, and they were interested in teaching us how the joint forces work together, how the Navy and Marines and so forth. So it's more of a leadership development type process, and not quite so much technical competency, but more of here's how the services work, here's your piece, and so forth. And so officers that leave there can fill a variety of jobs, not necessarily just be a chemical officer, but so forth. And that was an interesting thing. I went to another school a few years later. It was a college, and the highlight of both of those schools was softball and basketball and soccer. So I told everybody I went on an athletic scholarship, not an academic scholarship.
There you go.
But we had a great time, and I met a lot of officers at that school and then the college that I ended up working with over my career, and some of them I still know and still communicate with. Pretty interesting. And I think that's another part of the education and training process for the military is you develop a group of colleagues that you end up serving with. Because in those days, you didn't homestead, you didn't stay in the same unit over and over and over. You went here, 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 and here. We ended up 17 different places while I was in the military. 17 different jobs, assignments, and so forth. But if you go into an outfit or to an office or to an organization, and you got a couple of buddies in there that you knew, you've instantly got a network. How the heck are things done around here?
Right.
Where do you go?
Right.
Where's the right string to pull? That kind of thing. So, and I met some really good friends, and a couple of them we still communicate with today. We email and Christmas card, and they come through here. 2 years ago, I had two of my best buddies come through here, and they had never been to Clemson. They fell in love with this place. Took them to a football game and showed them around town, and we had a great time. And they said, "My goodness, how'd you ever leave this place?" So I had that was a good part of the education and training, though. And this is something for you. The military is probably the best organization for training its people. They have a very good leader development program, technical and leadership development, and they do it over your whole lifetime that you're in the military. You don't just go once and graduate, if you would. And what I found, I went to work for probably the premier research and development company in the world when I retired from the military in '94. They didn't train them. They didn't have a leader development program, So they had their young people. They kind of had to learn on their own. And I'll tell you, leadership, you have to be. There's some training involved. There's some development. There's mentoring, And so it was. I really did, as I look back on my life, the education and training I got in the military, I value quite highly. It was very good.
Okay.
Very rewarding.
So kind of tell us, you mentioned you did this training as a higher ranking officer. Where did you go after that?
Well, when I left the staff college, I went to the 9th Infantry Division out at Fort Lewis, and it was going through a renovation of how to develop a unit. They called it the high-tech testbed, HTTB. The 9th Infantry Division was going through this, and so the guy out there knew that I was kind of an out-of-the-box thinker, so he brought me out there, and I was the chemical officer for 3 years. And he realized that we had a force structure of about 160 soldiers, and they were trained to, their fundamental duty was, if we get attacked with chemical, biological, and nuclear, to clean it up. The mission's decontamination, if you would, clean up. And he said, you guys got to do more than that, because what if there's no war? So we got got lieutenants, young kids, smart sergeants. So we got together and we came up with a triple mission. And so we experimented with having not only the ability to do the decontamination, but you didn't want to wittingly or knowingly contaminate yourself. So we figured out, why don't we have a capability to do reconnaissance to avoid this stuff? So we developed some capability and got some equipment, and ultimately got some vehicles that you could figure out where the stuff was so you could get around it. And then the last one was one of the classic missions of the chemical from the start was smoke generation. In World War II, when they used to use smoke generators to generate smoke, these clouds, to protect airfields, to protect ports, if they do river crossings or open. And I don't know if you've ever seen them, but they make the most beautiful white puffy smoke. So anyway, we had these units that had the ability to do the decontamination. Well, they weren't fighting, they would take these units that you'd heat water and do all this, provide showers. So they'd run a shower point first, so units could come back and they'd have hot water and it'd clean off their equipment and everything. So we innovated out there and had a great time out there. And so I stayed out there. I was on that staff for 3 years as the chemical officer and had a lot of fun. Well, I was fortunate enough to get selected to be a maintenance commander. So I commanded a maintenance battalion for 2 years. As it turned out, the unit had a missile maintenance company, a heavy equipment maintenance company, a transportation company, a medical company, and an electronics maintenance. And I had 5 companies in there, and 4 out of the 5 commanders were women. 3 of them West Pointers.
Wow. And
so here I was from 1972 when they integrated. Here it was 1985, 13 years, and here's some of the best and brightest leaders, young leaders in our military were women. So that was pretty cool. And my job was called the Main Support Battalion. I had 1,200 people in there, in my battalion. And I had a hoot of a time. And well, it was one of the most interesting parts of it was I had 100 and the most I ever had was 140 women, and the fewest pregnant I had were 20. So one of the challenges that units have, if they have young men and women in there, is they get married and they have kids, and the most I ever had at one time was 44. I had 44 women that were pregnant in the unit. And so one of the challenges you have is who picks up their work, so they work till they have to go and so forth. And when I was commanding the battalion, if you got pregnant, you could get out. So there'd be a handful over the course of my command, the only reason they got pregnant was to get out. They didn't like the Army. So that happened. But after I went to the staff college, I was the guy who was the commander of this high-tech division out there had gotten promoted to 3 stars, and he was the head of the joint the Pentagon has a Army, Navy, Air Force. They also have a joint staff.
Okay.
Have you heard that term?
Yes, sir.
So I went to work for the joint staff,
Okay.
and I was the chemical officer for the joint staff. And while we were there, we had I did two fundamental things, and it's probably a career highlight was probably a career low light. And
Tell us about it.
yeah, the Army, the nation was our chemical weapons by 1985 or so were basically obsolete. They were old. They hadn't been used. They were all designed and built around World War II, and up to about the 60s, there was a big program to build up your chemical weapons. And had over 30,000 tons of chemical weapons. 30,000 tons. So we entered into a program to modernize our chemical weapons. And they wanted them to be safe and storage and easy to handle. So they came up with a concept called a binary chemical weapon. So you'd have two components. Both of them by themselves were not bad. You mix them, bad. Nerve gas, okay?
Sure.
Lethal gas.
Sure.
So we had an artillery shell, we had a rocket, and we had a bomb. Rocket head, artillery shell, rocket warhead, and a bomb. The artillery shell was fielded in production. The rocket, the bomb was not. They hadn't got the bomb finished. The Navy was responsible for the bomb. They had a Navy program manager, captain. And in I forget exactly the moment, but the Secretary of State was Jim Baker, who's you might see on TV now. He was a very distinguished Texan for President Reagan. And his counterpart was a guy named Shevardnadze, who's I think a Ukrainian, who ended up being the president of Ukraine. They met out at Wyoming at Baker's Ranch, and they agreed to get rid of all our chemical weapons. So we were in the middle of this development program, and about 4 o'clock one afternoon, I get a call. I was sitting at my desk, and Colin Powell, the secretary, called me and said, "Come down here on me. Colin Powell wants to talk to you." And so I'll go down there, and here's this general that I work for. And General Powell was sitting in there. And General Powell said, "I got to go to a meeting upstairs in 30 minutes." And the Secretary of State has asked Dick Cheney. Cheney was the Secretary of Defense. Asked Dick Cheney, "What's going on with our binary weapons our chemical weapons program?" So he told me, he said, "What do you think?" So I told him, here's the history. I said, "We've got the type classified on the artillery shell. We got this, we got that." I said, "The Navy hadn't finished with their bomb production." He said, "What do you think?" I said, "Well, the Senate, I don't think the Senate's going to give us any money to buy it, even if they type classify it." He said, "Neither do I." He said, "Do you think we ought to just go ahead and get rid of our chemical weapons?" And I said, "Well, you're asking me, a career chemical officer." That's what I've done for my whole career. I said, "But quite honestly, I think our conventional weapons are more powerful, more effective than chemical weapons are in our concept of maneuver." He said, "I agree. I don't think we'll ever use," he said, "I don't think this president will ever use nuclear weapons or chemical weapons, ever." We didn't have any biological weapons. We'd got rid of them. And so he said, "I'm going to go upstairs and meet with Secretary Cheney." So I go back to my office. I'm sitting there, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock. 6:30, the phone rings. It's the secretary. He said, "General Powell wants to see you." So I walked down there. He said, "Frank, I agreed with the Secretary of Defense. We're going to terminate the binary program." So I walked back down to my office, chin on the floor. So I called the head guy who was our head guy in the chemical corps. So I had to call him and tell him what happened.
Yeah.
And his name was Jerry Watson. He was a 2-star general. He was out at the Defense Nuclear Agency. He's leading that program out there. He was the commander out there, director. So I called him. I said, "Sir, this is Frank. I got some bad news for you." I told him exactly what happened, and he said, "Frank, you did the best you could." He said, "This darn program, we've been fighting this program for 12 years. And to be honest," he said, "it's probably the right thing." So that was a very serious moment in my career for me. I felt good about it, but man, that was a tough day. But I've got another Colin Powell story. Now, the Colin Powell was one of the nicest interacting people you ever wanted to meet. And I was out there, and I was out walking by his office one day, and he looked at me. He said, "Frank, come in here. I want you to meet somebody." So I go in there, and the woman, and I can't remember her name now, but she had won the Iditarod 2 or 3 times. It was a female. She was hard looking, let me tell you. She wasn't pretty. She wasn't all decked out. She was hard. And she had 3 of her huskies.
Wow.
Big, beautiful, blue-eyed dogs. And there were about 6 of us standing there. And he said, "This is one of the most amazing women that ever lived. She's won 5 Iditarods or something like that. 2,000 miles, 40 below zero, taking care of her animals and everything. Susan Belcher or some name like that. Anyway, she ended up dying of breast cancer. But he said, "This is one fine lady." And so I just had several encounters with him. And I had another encounter when I was up there with the secretary, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs was an admiral named Bill Crowell, C-R-O-W-E. And Admiral Crowell was famous for his hats. He had hundreds of these crazy hats that people had given him all over and right behind his desk he had a Oklahoma football helmet. And Clemson, that year Clemson played Oklahoma in the Citrus Bowl and we beat them. And they fired their coach. Coach was Switzer. And I called down and I said, "Get Coach Ford to sign a Clemson baseball cap, send it to me." So they sent it up to me, and I took it in there, and he took that hat, put it right on top of the helmet. Barry Switzer was the Oklahoma coach. So that was a great thing. And he did the exact same thing that Colin Powell did from a different perspective. I got a call from his secretary, Colin Powell's secretary, and Admiral Crowell's secretary was 6'2".
Wow. And
wore heels and had hair. And a big hair, big hair.
Yeah.
She just had, so she was at least that much taller than me, at least. So I'd stroll in her office, and she'd say, "The chairman wants to see you," and I'd go in there. Well, Admiral Crowell went in there, and he said, "Sit down, I want to talk to you." So on the TV was there'd been this huge earthquake in Russia, and it was chaos. And they had called the military in to help with all that. And he said, "Frank, they can't even get a bulldozer to get to an earthquake site. How in the heck are they going to fight us?" What he said? He said, "I don't think they're a threat anymore. I think their military is not a formidable threat." They had every 2 years they had an all volunteer. I mean, they had a draft army. So Will would come in, they'd go to training, they'd go to a unit, 2 years later they'd back home. So they just didn't have any continuity. They didn't get that rhythm you needed to have. And he said, "I don't think they're as formidable of a threat as." So that was an interesting comment from the top military guy. So I had a couple of exposures during my career, and I regard those as some pretty interesting moments and reflection in my time. Now the job I went to, the last job I went to, well, I had after I left the Pentagon, with that wonderful exposure to the leadership, I went to Utah. Dugway Proving Ground is a military base where they actually test. In World War II, they tested chemical and biological weapons, and they tested them outdoors. Used to kill sheep, tether goats out there and shoot stuff out. Well, in the '68, they had killed some sheep out there that was off the reservation, off the post. They terminated open air testing, or outdoor testing. So all the chemical agent and biological agent work that was done out there was done indoors in these special safety containers, if you would. And that was a real interesting experience to go out there and see the scientists and technicians, how they did all the testing. And I was out there doing Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and they had issued 700,000 sets of chemical clothing and masks and all these things. And so they had us going through a very, very rigorous around-the-clock quality control program to make sure everything worked. And so my guy just worked for months, just round the clock to make sure all that worked. And that was pretty interesting. And living in Utah was an interesting experience. In the base that I was at, the Uguay Proving Ground, the commander was also the base commander, the mayor, and the commander. And if you worked there, regardless of whether you were in the military or not, you could live there. So I actually had a little community out there. The nearest stop sign was 45 miles away. Salt Lake City was about 80 miles away. So it was out in the middle of nowhere. And so I had a few interesting human experiences out there with people in my community that weren't military and so forth. But I was known as commander. They didn't call me colonel, they called me commander. Commander Cox, how are you? And so that was a great experience. Then my last job in the military was back in the Pentagon. And I was in the Office of Secretary of Defense. And I was the chemical officer on duty in there. And I think I told you as we were talking, the two most memorable things I did, and probably the legacy that I did, was at Desert Seal, Desert Storm, we were not prepared as a military force in case they used biological weapons against us. We just weren't prepared. We didn't have detection equipment. We didn't have the antidotes, if you would. We didn't have the preventive shots and series of all that sufficient to do what was needed. So I helped, along with a few other people, we created what we call the Biological Defense Program and got it started from scratch and rejuvenated the Defense Department's bio program. And when I retired, I had duty there for about 2 years before I retired. I went to work for a company in Ohio, and we had this extraordinary capability to do microbiology in this company and stuff. And we had a health unit, and I was in the national security unit. We were doing work for the Defense Department and everything. He was mostly dealing with the health community and Health and Human Services and CDC and things like that. So we had a meeting, and the big boss said, "Are there any markets that we ought to go after?" And I said, "Yeah, we ought to look at the vaccine program. We ought to be capable of testing here these vaccines using our animal labs and the things we had the capability to do. And DOD has a pretty good program." And I said, they've probably got $100 million a year in research and development that they're spending. So he asked the guy who was from Health and Human Services. He said, "No, they're not interested in it. They're worried about two things: AIDS and antibiotic-resistant tuberculosis." And 2 weeks later, they had the anthrax letters in the Senate. Within a year, they had $1 billion in Health and Human Services. $1 billion to do research. And so they put a lot of money into the biological threat. And I feel real good, personally, as I reflect back over my career, that we helped put in place an institutional process where they could actually do it. You can't give somebody $1 billion in the government. They can't spend it unless they have a program and have the ability to do things. So I was proud of that. The other thing is, and when right in the middle of at the end of the Gulf War, our intelligence community sent people out with all our allies and asked about their experiences, equipment, what'd you find, and so forth. Well, one morning there was a headline in the paper that the Hungarian force that was over there had detected nerve agent in Saudi Arabia, that the Iraqis had used chemical agents against us. So the Pentagon went nuts.
Yeah.
So they convened this defense, they call it Defense Science Board. We put a panel together, had about 15 very distinguished doctors, you name it, and got all the information that was available on that. We had people come in, and what we determined, it was physically impossible for the Iraqis to have shot chemical weapons that had any impact. First of all, the winds were blowing during that time frame. The winds were blowing predominantly from Saudi Arabia to north. So they're not going to use chemical weapons that blow back into their own face. Secondly, it was out of range. They didn't have any weaponry that could have delivered that. So, but while we were doing that, what we uncovered doing that process was, first thing they wanted to determine, were there any human effects from these? So out of the woodwork, people started coming out. So it turns out there were thousands of people that came back and were suffering from various ailments. So they couldn't figure out what it was. So we had all these scientists come in, and doctors, preeminent doctors from Health and Human Services, from the military. We found out how many people had been exposed to one of the weapons they used out of a tank. They had a depleted uranium tank round, and a couple of tanks had been hit by our own thing. So there were about 30 people that had shrapnel from depleted uranium in their bodies.
Wow.
And so like 30 of those. There were about 100 cases of something called leishmaniasis, which is basically like a leprosy. It's a disease. And so on and on and on. And what we've uncovered was there's this phenomenon called post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And we had experts come in and start talking about it and everything. And the outcome of the science board was, you're going to have soldiers that deploy, and when they come back, they're going to suffer from these things. Some of it's going to be from the trauma of seeing people killed or get shot or so forth. Some of them are just going to be from leaving their comfortable world and being exposed to, and they're going to come back, they're going to have these, there's about 8 or 10 common symptoms like this. And so they actually made a decision and recommended to the leadership of the DOD that if a soldier comes back and they have these symptoms, that they be treated as a veteran in the VA system or in our health system, and as a recognized problem, because before they didn't recognize it as a problem. They treated whatever the disorder was and not recognize it as a problem. So they kind of defined what PTSD was. I felt real good about that. Now at the time, I didn't think much of it. You know, it's just kind of the outcome of the board. But now that this 10-year plus conflict now, there's a lot of people that suffer from PTSD. You know, it really is. So that was, I think, in my life, that would be I left a little mark there. My name won't be associated with it, but I feel pretty good about that. I'm sorry about that. And interrupt the thing. Let me just cut it off real quick.
You're fine. All right, so can you talk to us a little bit about the change from when you were in Vietnam to now with PTSD?
Yeah, I sure can.
The cultural changes
I think that's a great question, Will. I think if you lived in the post-Vietnam era and you saw a lot of these Vietnamese Vietnam veterans, and they were shabby dressed and long hair and they were suffering from PTSD, a lot of them, and they weren't recognized by the institution, the DOD or the VA, as having this PTSD, and they were looked down upon. You know, they really were. The emergence of the emergence of the anti-Vietnam culture that came so rabid and so aggressive, and it involved so many of our young people, that the young people did not associate very well. Even though the Vietnam War was a draft war. The people that went over there didn't go because they wanted to. They were drafted over there. And a lot of them were not equipped for what a lot of people got involved with drugs over there, heroin and so forth, marijuana. So the Vietnamese, the Vietnam era veteran was, I think, did not have the self-respect that the soldiers of today have. And I'm not sure how our culture swung over to where they are today, but today most Americans respect the men and women that are serving in the Army today. They don't understand a lot what they do, and they don't understand why they do it in a lot of cases, but they respect them. I'd say there were very few military that served in Vietnam more than twice, some 3, but 2 times was probably. These guys have been in Iraq and Afghanistan 5, 6 times, so they've been in harm's way a lot more. So I think that a lot of I don't think that the global war and terrorism veteran, the Iraqi-Afghanistan terrorism soldier, lacks self-esteem or self-respect. I think their communities reach out to them. The Wounded Warrior programs, Intrepid, a lot of these programs reach out to them. But I think the violence and it's hard to picture when you fight when everybody looks the same and you're shooting somebody that doesn't look like a soldier. So I think there's just it's hard for, no matter what it is, it's the men and women in uniform today have a tough time. And they work at it. They're given, the Army has a program called, our DOD has a program called Resilience. And the leadership is they're training soldiers. This is what you can expect. Here's some techniques. They have psychiatrists and psychologists in the unit. So I mean, they're much better focused today to handle the PTSD than they were after Vietnam.
Sure.
And so, I don't. My very best friend in the military tells a story that his father served in Korea, and when he came home, he suffered for 40 years with PTSD. And he didn't find out that he really had it until he had volunteered in a VA hospital to deliver mail. He'd go up there once a week and go around and deliver mail to the people. And he had a buddy over there, and they started sitting down with a group of them and started talking. And after about 2 months, he realized that he was suffering PTSD. So he called his son and said, "Son, I just want to tell you, I'd have been a much better dad if I'd done something about it 40 years ago." So I think the message that the Army's gotten, the veterans are getting, is do something about it. When you come home, if you can't sleep at night and things are bothering you, get some help. Go see a psychologist or psychiatrist or something like that. So I think the culture is much better equipped to deal with it. But I'll tell you, it's a real problem. And the symptoms are, the health symptoms are pretty remarkable. It's not only is it the depression or the neurological kind of things, but you have trouble eating, you have trouble with your bowel, and just a lot of things. You have rashes and all kind of things. So it's an interesting. That was one of the most interesting experiences of my career, and I've watched that with a lot of interest over since then. And but I tell you, Will, here's I think the bottom line for. I had a remarkable experience in Vietnam, but I'm learning a little bit about culture today. And we built when I was there, we built a base. I was responsible for the base. When we got ready to leave, we bulldozed the base to the ground and buried it. I was the last person to leave. The helicopter flew in, the bulldozers and everything had pulled away. We left the concertina wire around. When I left, there must have been 1,000 people out there. When we lifted off, they just swarmed on the place, digging up all this stuff. I don't know why we just didn't leave it standing so they could have the wood, metal, and everything. And to this day, it kind of haunts me a little bit that how do you mix goodwill with good intentions and doing your military business and so forth? Because you leave a scar. If you go over there and you build a base and everything, and then you just tear it down, or you bury it, and so forth. So I'm hoping that what's going on now is the bases are much more sophisticated. The modular units that build them like mobile homes, and they have air conditioning and all that. I hope when they leave Afghanistan and Iraq, they leave them intact for the people over there that don't have anything. So I don't know if they do or not. I want to show you some pictures that have been a lasting impression of when I left Vietnam. That was one of my lasting images of leaving Vietnam, was seeing this horde of people swarming out on this base to try to get some of the materials they could use. Because a lot of the homes over there did have palm branches for roofs and so forth. They didn't have the houses like we have, I can tell you that. They probably still don't.
Okay. And I know also you mentioned earlier when we were talking before the interview that you and your wife are very involved with giving back to servicemen.
Yeah, my wife was an Army brat. Her dad was an Army colonel when she grew up, lived at Fort Benning, and she grew up in an Army culture. And so when we got married and we decided to stay in the Army, she was as committed to being a part of the scene as I was, and she literally sacrificed a career, if you would, to traipse around all these bases and everything. But what we tried to do, and I think was the legacy, is we tried to embrace the people that we worked with, and we literally loved the people that we worked with and got to know them, got to know their families, tried to lead them to make good decisions in their lives, and those that wanted to stay in the Army, tried to influence them, what it was like and what life in the Army would be like for a family. She volunteered in the Red Cross. One of the things the Red Cross does for the military is if a soldier family member is ill or so forth, they call it notification. Mm-hmm. She was a notifier. Mm-hmm. And so she started doing that in about 1972. She's still a Red Cross volunteer today. So she's been doing that for 40 years as a Red Cross volunteer. So I think the legacy that we tried to leave, the two of us as an Army family team, was the importance of supporting each other and being involved with the unit and being involved with the people and so forth. We had a great time. And the family, the Army coined a term, the Army family and the family support groups and so forth. Today they have professionals that do that in the military. They actually have people that are trained, and they take care of when the soldiers are gone. The families have somebody to call to coordinate, I need to get to the hospital, or what do I do about getting a new identification or parking or something. Well, the wives did that. My wife did that for 26 years. She was a family supporter. So, but I look back, I had a wonderful career in the military. I met some great guys. There are some great people here. I've been involved since I got back to Clemson in something called the Clemson Corps. And the Clemson was all male, all military from 1989 to 55 when they went co-educational. And the Clemson Corps' primary mission is to perpetuate the legacy of that wonderful group of men that came through Clemson and what all it meant to the culture of the university. And also the ROTC units, we provide a scholarship program to supplement the students that are in the ROTC program, to make ROTC a little bit more attractive to people that want to be in the ROTC program. And so this year, for the next 2 years, I'll be the chairman. And we've had a pretty distinguished group of chairmen. And on this campus, the Clemson's campus, the Clemson course got a nice footprint, some of the things that we've done.
Definitely.
Yeah, so it's been a real pleasure serving in the military, and I'll be 69 this year, and I'm still kicking, still talking about our beloved Army.
Yeah. All right. Is there anything else you would like to talk about, or any reflections?
No, I just think it's a great initiative, and I appreciate the students for participating in this and capturing all this. I've got a video of my dad when he retired. He went over to the Calhoun Mansion, and he had about a 3-hour interview just kind of talking about the history of Clemson and so forth, and I really appreciate it. So someday it'll be some research you'll be doing, 30, 40, 50 years from now.
Yeah.
It'll be a valuable piece of thing. So thank you, Will. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you, sir. Thank you for your service to our country and to Clemson and everything that you've done.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the interview.
Thank you.